Well, good evening. And welcome to our February 1st Thursday program. Boy, what a great crowd. And hopefully it won't be raining again when our program's over with. It's nice to see it let up at least for a little bit. Now, those of you who came in through the front doors probably noticed that we've been busy with our exhibit project. We're usually busy, but it's not always that evident. We're working. We've completed demolition or starting working on the walls, and pleased with the progress. And no, I don't have a date for completion, but stop in occasionally. You'll see our progress. It's pretty exciting to be working on this new long-term exhibit. If you had a chance to pick up one of the flyers at the back, you know what some of our other programs are coming up. Next First Thursday program in March is on Longview postcards, and Mike Perry has a great collection. He collects postcards of the area. A couple years ago, he did one showing us the postcards of Kelso, so we had to have to come back and show them at Longview. These are the real photo postcards, so they're real detailed. For example, this one back here of the ship and the train there at the Kalama dock, that's from a real photo postcard. Give you some idea of some of the details. So I guarantee you'll learn something new about Longview, and next day you'll tell somebody what you learned, so that should be a great program. In April, we have one on the logging railroads of the Pacific Northwest. Author Gary Durs completed a book on that topic, looking at the more recent ones, and that should be a real interesting program. I'm not aware of their extent and what all they did. So then in May for our annual Longview program, we're going to look at the history of the Longview schools. And some of you might have seen the DVD at the 23 Club in October. So we'll be showing it again for those you want to see it again, or those who want to see it for the first time. Real interesting seeing the changes in the school. I got some great interviews with students and teachers and administrators. And then in June, we have one on the history of Westport, Oregon. And Jim Elberg's completed a great book on the topic. His great-great-grandfather, John West, was the founder. Who knew that it was named after someone instead of a direction? But he's going to come and talk to us about the history of Westport. So that's what we have planned for coming up, and I hope to see you here. We're real delighted to have Irene Martin here to speak to us tonight. Irene Martin is, I think, the premier historian of the Lower Columbia area. She's been researching and writing about it. She's published a number of books. I think the last time she was here, she spoke about the Bumblebee Cannery in Astoria. She's got a book on that topic, and a great book on Wahkiakum County and some other things here too. She'll have these for sale if you want to purchase them. Irene's lived in Skamackway for 40 years, but her husband's family goes back there to the 1870s. That's probably the genesis of this program tonight, is the family history. She's spoken to us before, besides the Bumblebee. I was trying to remember the last time, and so I went on to our photo collection, and here's a photo of you talking to the group in 1988, so you can have that.
Never mind.
That was when we took a tour to the Redmond Hall down in Skamackway, which was recently opened as a tour group. So other hat she wears, she's an Episcopal priest at St. James in Cathlamet, and given the title of tonight's program, I'm wondering what your sermon titles are like. It's just a great title, but it's Mail Order Brides and Ship Jumpers, Immigration in the Lower Columbia River. Irene Martin.
Thank you. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I chose the title for this talk because I've been doing some genealogical research on my husband's family. And as it turned out, that genealogical research resulted in finding out about several people who jumped ship when they came here, and more than one mail-order bride. Who knew? So what I found, though, when I was going through this, normally when I'm researching something, history leads me into something else. In this case, however, genealogy led me into history, because what I realized was there are a lot of people that came in rather unusual ways to the Lower Columbia River. And a lot of them were men who jumped ship, and a lot of them were women who came as mail-order brides, had never met the men they were going to marry before and maybe knew them for 2 weeks and got married after they arrived here. So let's start a little bit about what the history of ship jumping was all about. In the lower Columbia River, early settlement began as a result of early exploration and trade, both overland and by sea, but mainly by sea. Sailing vessels appeared off the coast by the late 18th century, and their numbers grew as trade with various natural resources such as furs, lumber, and salmon expanded. By the 1850s and 60s, settlements of early pioneers had formed, populated with employees of former trading companies, immigrants from the East Coast and other nations, and in a surprising number of cases, sailors who had left their ships. Now, in those days, the dangers of travel were many. Seamen who signed on to a vessel were in danger of storms or unseaworthy vessels, brutal captains, or shanghaiing when they got to port. They might be gone for months with little or no contact with family members back home. They traveled around the world, including through dangerous straits where pirates or privateers were waiting to capture and plunder their ships. They worked on sailing vessels with all the dangers of depending upon the wind for propulsion. The two main sea routes from Europe to the western seaboard in the 1860s and 70s were by sailing vessel around Cape Horn, a journey of approximately 18,000 miles, or across the Isthmus of Panama with the danger of tropical diseases such as malaria and yellow fever. It's not all that well known, but in fact, I did a lot of research on this because it began to dawn on me just how horrific work was on some of those sailing vessels. The conditions were appalling. In the US, the Merchant Seamen's Act of 1790 permitted physical coercion by ship's captains, as well as capture and forced return or imprisonment if sailors attempted to leave the ship without fulfilling their contract. Freedom of labor existed among nearly all other occupations except that of sailor and fisherman, despite the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which declared an end to involuntary servitude. It should be noted that the 1792 Fugitive Slave Act's terms were modeled to a great degree on the Merchant Seamen's Act. Additionally, anyone who helped a sailor leaving his ship was also liable to punishment. Similar laws existed in Britain and other countries, wherein sailors could be disciplined by flogging, beating, withholding of food and water, and imprisonment. In the latter half of the 19th century on the Columbia River, when a ship arrived in Portland or Astoria, a runner or crimp from a sailor's boarding house would meet the ship and try to entice crew members to leave the ship, promising them better wages on a different vessel. They promised them food, drink, entertainment, usually female in nature, and a comfortable stay at a boarding house while awaiting the next vessel. The captains winked at the arrangement because it meant they didn't have to board the crew members while in port. And if the crew member deserted, he forfeited his pay, which then reverted to the captain. The captain could get a new crew by dealing with the same crimps who had stolen his former crew members. If all else failed, shanghaiing or kidnapping a hapless passerby or frequenter of the waterfront was a solution. It was basically a waterborne Ponzi scheme that brutalized men who had little protection under the law. And Astoria and Portland and the places between were famous internationally for their skills at crimping and shanghaiing. To their credit, there were people who attempted to rescue men who jumped ship and tried to get away from the brutal life at sea. For example, C.B. Dow, and I quote from the Astoria newspaper, "A staunch, square, honest farmer and temperance man, was one of the farmers in the Astoria area who defied the sailors' boarding house runners. If discovered, the sailors could be taken forcefully from their place of refuge without recourse, and the person who was hiding them could also be punished by fines and imprisonment." Numerous ship jumpers started at West Point, Oregon, my husband's great-grandfather among them, and were protected by the locals. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the conditions in Europe and where a lot of the ship jumpers and the people that worked on these vessels came from, and many of them came from the Scandinavian countries. In the 1860s in particular, and in the 70s, Sweden and Norway experienced years of famine. There was no food, it was overcrowded, people were hungry, and so shipping out was really one of the few things that would reduce the population and allow people to actually earn some sort of a living. And so a lot of young men did that. Norway and Sweden were a united kingdom under a common monarch and foreign policy from about 1814 to 1905. However, each country followed its own laws, constitutions, and customs. The partnership between the two countries was strained, especially when conditions were poor. And the first members of my husband's family who arrived on the scene here were from Norway and Sweden. They were representative of many other families at the time who led the Scandinavian countries, signed on with a vessel, and worked their way to America. They might stay with the same vessel, or transfer to another, or jump ship and join another vessel headed in the general direction they wanted to go. They worked their way to the west coast, and when they got to the Columbia River, they seized their opportunity, jumped ship, and hid out at one or more of the many tiny communities then forming along the river around the salmon canning industry. There were no roads in the 1860s and 70s, no railroads, and the only means of transportation was by boat. Jobs, however, were readily available: fishing, working in canneries, logging camps, or sawmills. Now, some of the research I've done, and this sort of will tie into Jim Albert's presentation coming up later this year, is about Westport. And what I've been able to figure out, there was almost like an underground railroad along the Columbia River for seamen who abandoned their ships. And it was centered on Westport, Oregon, where sailors who jumped ship could find a job fishing, working in the cannery of the lumber mill, with very few questions being asked. John West, an early immigrant from Scotland for whom the town was named, was an entrepreneur who established a lumber mill and later in 1869 a salmon cannery. His enterprise also included a salmon saltery and a boat building facility, and he needed labor. He leased boats to fishermen, so there was no need for them to make a major capital investment to get started in the fishing business. He also employed sailors for vessels that he owned. Westport seems to have been the center of a wave of immigrants who had fixed their hopes on working their way on ships to the shores of America and then establishing themselves there. As Jim Albert's recent history of Westport indicates, Westport's early residents were Scandinavian immigrants. They were employed as farmers, fishermen, boat builders, mill workers, and loggers. And then he states, for decades, Westport residents interacted with countless ethnic seamen from countries around the world. The seamen were usually poor. They might be orphans or illegitimate children. And that was the case of my husband's Swedish great-grandfather. An illegitimate child in Sweden had very little in the way of a future. There were certain occupations that were closed to them, and they could not inherit from either parent. That law, they finally, I think in like the 1890s, 94, the law was changed so they could inherit from their mother. However, they could not inherit from their father till the law was changed in the 1970s. So basically, they were cut off from the family from the get-go, which meant, realistically, they had to look elsewhere. Other people that came over here and jumped ship might be escaped slaves. Again, turning to Westport, in 1870, the census notes a black man, John Belford, and calls him a fisherman born in Africa, residing there. One might guess he was a runaway slave who crewed on a vessel and jumped ship. 19th century crews frequently contained runaway slaves or free blacks, and again, with a shortage of labor, not many questions were asked. James de Sol was a black man who deserted a vessel called the Peacock after she wrecked at the mouth of the Columbia in 1841, and he established himself in Oregon. He ran a little sailing vessel taking freight back and forth between Astoria and Cathlamet. One of the reasons for the ethnic diversity on board deep-sea vessels during the 19th century was, and I'm quoting from a thesis by Kenneth Coleman, it was not feasible for either American or British ships to meet the demand for maritime labor with all-white crews. Warships, merchant ships, naval boats, and vessels commanded by pirates and privateers all needed sailors. And so they were competing with each other, and they would take pretty much anybody they could get. For laborers in the 19th century, toiling aboard a deep-sea vessel was among the most difficult, dangerous, and least remunerative work possible. This often again resulted in sailors deserting their ships when they reached a habitable seaport, which was one of the few forms of resistance available to them at that time. But you can feature with the kind of labor that they were doing, that once they found a place that looked like it might be habitable, if they had very little in the way of ties elsewhere, it probably looked better than the ship did at that point. Frequent desertion and disciplinary problems on deep-sea voyage created job opportunities for sailors located in various seaports. For instance, the James de Soule, the black man I told you about a few minutes ago, joined the Wilkes expedition following the desertion of 8 men during its brief stop in Callao, including the ship's cook, whom de Soule likely replaced. This was not an unusual number for an expedition that ultimately lost over half of its original crew of 346 to desertion, death, and dismissal. You can see this was not a very occasional thing. It was widespread, that people left ships very frequently. And when you're talking about something like the Wilkes expedition, where over half of the crew deserted or died at some point during the whole voyage, you get some idea of the numbers of people that crewed on those ships and then decided, I've had it, and left. And some of them were doing specifically with the idea they were going to find another place to live. And my husband's great-grandfathers were among those. The U.S. was actively recruiting immigrants at that time. You've heard of the Homestead Act and the Donation Land Claim Act. Neither of those acts required a person to be a citizen to acquire land. All you had to do was to build a home, live in it, pay a fee, and clear a certain amount of acreage, and then eventually file the claim that enabled you to keep that land. And so people who had had nothing over in the old country managed to work their way around the globe, basically, and suddenly they had free land. One of them was my husband's great-grandfather, the Norwegian side, Eric Martin, who jumped ship in Rio de Janeiro and somehow eventually landed in Westport, and then off to Skamakawe. John Strum was my husband's Swedish great-grandfather, and he, with his best friend Nell Sanderson and another friend, Charles Wilson, all jumped ship in Portland from the same German vessel, the Hertha, and hid out in the lower Columbia. John Strum came down the Washington side and ended up at the Polwarth fishing establishment just upriver from Cathlamet and moved to Westport shortly after. Nell Sanderson came down the Oregon side from Portland and ended up in Westport. They split up because they didn't want to be caught together, kind of split their forces. Charles Wilson, same vessel, also made his way to Westport. All eventually ended up in Skamakawe. Occasionally, a sailor literally jumped off a ship and tried to swim to shore, and some drowned. A number of small cemeteries along the Columbia have burials recorded as unknown sailor. I think some of them were accidents, but I don't think they were all accidents. In order to facilitate ship jumping and then disappearing off the face of the earth, people did a number of different things. They changed their names. Johan Rydström, my husband's Swedish great-grandfather, became John Strum. Eric Martinius Tollefson became Eric Martin. Carl Olsen became Charles Wilson. August Lund, another Swedish sailor who had jumped ship in Liverpool and come to the U.S., changed his name to Peter Johnson and fought in the Civil War, which was another avenue to obtaining entry to the U.S. When he settled in Skamakawe, he changed his name back to August Lund, which caused some difficulties in eventually claiming his pension, especially since his original name before Pete Johnson and August Lund was actually Lundquist. So it gets a little complicated after a while. Joseph Megler, also from Europe, also fought in the Civil War. It is not known how he arrived in the U.S., though there is some conjecture that he was serving aboard a sailing vessel and got to New York. One of the things that I've discovered by scrounging through all my husband's stuff, I wrote a book of poetry a couple of years ago called The Family That Never Threw Anything Away. And actually, as I've been doing the genealogy, I'm pretty glad now that they didn't. But he has Eric Martin's sea chest. And I don't know if you've ever seen any of these sea chests. They have kind of a tarry canvas over them, and they're fairly small with rope handles. And usually when you lift the lid up, there's frequently a painting of the vessel that the person was on. There's one down in the Maritime Museum on display, a very nice one down in Astoria. If you're ever in there, you can see it with a ship painted on the underside of the lid of the seaman's chest. And there was one on Eric Martin's sea chest as well, but it's been scratched out. So you couldn't, he shipped out from Norway, from Bergen, on a ship called the Breidablik. And she went to Rio de Janeiro, and that's where all traces vanish. And I think that's where he basically got rid of the picture of the Breidablik, and it's gone. You can see sort of where the outline of a ship, the name's gone, and the vessel itself on there. It's really a fascinating way of, obviously he wasn't taking any chances. Now we have a lot of documents from the family after they arrived here, but we have nothing from before. And basically from what I can figure out, they must have destroyed everything, trying to obliterate their identities when they got here, including the name changes. Now, let's get back to immigration for a moment. I remember the vessel, the Hertha, that I mentioned. I researched her, and it shows that she was a bark built in Germany in 1865, which at that time a lot of vessels were being built for transporting immigrants to the US. Ships would take European would-be immigrants to rich ports such as Newcastle and Liverpool, and from there they would board a passenger vessel to the US. The sailors on those vessels thus worked their passage over and might jump ship when they got here. Now the Hertha was 163 feet long, 30 feet wide, with a hold depth of just under 20 feet. On the trip in 1870, when so many sailors deserted her in Portland, she had a cargo of 303 Chinese workers who were traveling to the US to work on the railroads. I just started doing some math on this one, and considering that the hold was approximately 5,000 square feet, and that there were at least another 7 to 10 people in addition to the 303 Chinese people on board to man the ship, plus any other cargo she might have been carrying, you could really pretty much describe the conditions on that ship as being akin to a slave vessel. It must have been appalling. And they came over from Hong Kong. It must have been a dreadful trip for everybody, and you can start to see why maybe so many people left. The Chinese workers that immigrated here, when I looked at the census for Wahkiakum County and other places, I've been struck by how young they were. Many of them were in their teens. We call them high school kids, basically, today. And they came from a place called Guangdong Province, which had gone through a period of immense flooding. And as a result, the farms had been wiped out that many of them had come from, and again, they were hungry, and they were looking for work. So they worked on the railroads and the mines and the canneries. Many became part of a Chinese work crew organized by what was called a China boss. Others found jobs in the logging camps where they had more freedom. And I'm going to pass a couple of things around to you to look at this point. I have two pictures here of Chinese workers. One is in the CRPA cannery down in Astoria, probably dates from the 1880s, and you'll see two young men and a child stacking cans in crates. And I'll start that around here. The other one is dated 1891 in Skamakawa, and it's the mill with the mill crew. And there's a man named, let's see where I can find him, Sailor Jack, who's over here. I have no idea why, but I've wondered if he maybe had just sort of dropped into Skamakawa from some ship. And in the doorway is Fong, the cook. It's one of the very few pictures I've seen where Chinese people are actually identified. So I wanted to pass it around and show you. Now, life in the 19th century in an undeveloped area of North America, like the Lower Columbia, was very difficult. In Wahkiakum County, where I live, old-growth forests of immense trees had to be cut down by axe and handsaw, sometimes known as a Swedish fiddle or a misery whip, in order to clear the land for farming and for dwellings. The swampy tidelands had to be ditched, diked, and drained to create land suitable for farming and grazing animals. And they were a stark contrast to the rocky soils and scraps of arable land found in much of Norway, My husband and I went to Norway this last year, and it really was a shock to realize what poor, rocky ground they were scratching a living out of over there. Due to the isolation of the area, where all traveling was by boat, pioneers either had to make what they needed or pack everything in on their backs if they purchased it. Hence the handmade wooden spoon. You didn't buy tools like that, you made them. Health-wise, the 19th century wasn't a paradise. Tuberculosis killed 1 in 7 people worldwide and was particularly prevalent in the damp climate in the Columbia River region and among sailors. There is a book by Joseph Conrad called The Nigger of the Narcissus. Some of you may have read that, where it talks about a dying sailor dying of tuberculosis. John Strum's half-brother in Sweden died of it, as did one of his children. Emil Martin, the son of Eric Martin, also contracted it, but did survive. Up to 40% of 19th century mortality rates were comprised of the deaths of children under the age of 5. Both the Martins and the Strums lost at least 2 children each under that age. Large families were a necessity to ensure some survivors remained to care for aging parents, but in an area with no medical care, childbirth was a risk for both mother and child. Both logging and fishing were dangerous occupations with high death rates from drowning and accidents, leaving families with no breadwinner. Due to high death rates, both for men and women, multiple marriages were common, and the life expectancy for both men and women was between the ages of 40 and 45. Now, marriage in those days, and we're getting to the mail-order bride part now, was very much an economic proposition. Women were needed to help with the farm, and children were the old age insurance for their parents. In Washington and Oregon, there was cheap or free land and plenty of natural resources. In Europe, repeated famines in the Scandinavian countries caused the Great Migration to the U.S. in the latter half of the 19th century. As one pioneer put it by being interviewed many years ago, hunger is what they was all afraid of. Now, the concept of a mail-order bride seems pretty foreign to us, unless we actually go on the internet and realize how many women are still being advertised for precisely that. It is not an unusual phenomenon today, and I actually know of a couple down in our area. And women from Colombia, Russia, Eastern Europe, the Philippines, and the Far East can all be found on the internet today. And it wasn't a whole lot different in the 19th century here. John Strum had a friend named Emma Christina Berg in Sweden, and they had a tentative agreement that they would marry once he got to the U.S., got a farm, got settled, and he would send for her and bring her back, and they would get married. Took him 7 years, and she waited the whole time. And he went back in 1873 and brought her back with him. A poem written by her friend Matilda Nelson talks a little bit about it, and I'm going to read that in a couple of minutes. However, her sister Sophie recognized that if she left, she would never see her again, and decided she would come to America with her as well. So we still have that battered copper tea kettle that you can see up here that they used on the sailing vessel around Cape Horn. John and Emma Christine Strum and Sophie Berg. John Strum's best friend, the ship jumper Nels Anderson, joined him in Westport, and 2 weeks after her arrival, he married Sophie Berg. And the family legend says that when he rowed the boat out to pick them up, she looked at him and said, "That's the man I'm going to marry." So life was one of those pretty basic in those days. Now, it gives you a little bit of an idea. What I have here is a poem written by Christine Berg's best friend, Matilda Nelson, in Swedish. I actually have the original here, but I'm not going to pass it around because it's very fragile. But this gives you an idea about basically how things were operating in the 19th century. Romance doesn't have a lot to do with it, though in some cases maybe a little. As earthly bride, you now have reached your goal, and he takes a bride who now carries you upon his loving arms to an unknown country, to an unknown path. Yes, unknown is also the path of life. So many destinies that you can't imagine. He meets somebody in this miserable valley, but also picks flowers of wordless happiness. Let the flowers be many, you deserve them, although the happiness of earth is like wretched wells which go dry as fast as time passes by, mostly leaving a fear of missing you. Keep the 3 flowers in your heart well, belief, hope, and love. Look, these are they. Then you will be faithful in happiness and in pain, and once finally to death itself. Goodbye. Goodbye, Christina. We do not look at each other as you now leave this district. You should not blame God's wise paths. Wherever you go, I hope you will be safe until God decides to separate you two when your hourglass here is empty. I hope you will be satisfied with God's will even then. He wants to turn everything so the end is good and happy. Goodbye, you 2 young people. May God be with you even in a path far away in a distant country and give you his peace. I pray for this. Then you will be safe, yes, all the way to the beach of heaven. I found that poem very moving, and in fact I entitled one of my books, The Beach of Heaven, which was about Bucayacum County. And Andrew Emlyn, whom some of you will know, has actually written a gospel song called The Beach of Heaven, which my husband claims his Lutheran ancestors would roll over in their graves if they heard it. But moving on, you get the idea, though, of what immigration was like for those women. They were leaving everything and everyone, their friends, their family, everything, and going to an unknown country. Christine Berg died on October 14th, 1899, at the age of 53. She had borne 9 children, of whom 7 lived at that point. And I find the poem that was written about her remembrance card at her funeral tells you something about what was expected of the working life of women in the 19th century, especially those immigrant women that came over as mail-order brides. And basically, it was nothing but work. And it goes like this: weep not that her toils are over, weep not that her race is run. God grant that we may rest as calmly when our work like hers is done. Till then we yield with gladness our mother to him to keep, and rejoice in the sweet assurance he giveth his beloved sleep. Now let's move on to the mail-order bride from Norway. Her name was Anna Olina Johansson, and she arrived in the U.S. at the age of 19 in 1878, and was married to Eric Martin 6 weeks later. They had apparently some kind of friend in Norway in common who had thought that, he might be a reasonable partner for her, and he sent the passage over, and she came over on a White Star Line vessel called the Celtic, and landed in New York. And then I have not been able to track how she got to Skamacaway from New York. And it's just one of those things. Sooner or later, I shall find it. But right now, I'm at a dead end on that one. The White Star Line provided bookings for immigrants, women in particular, who were coming from Europe, from Scandinavia and Scandinavian countries. The standard route was from Bergen or some other country or town in Europe to Liverpool and to New York. Anna Olina Martin died June the 1st, 1896, 2 days after the birth of her last child, Anna. She was 37 years old. August Lund was another person from Skamacaway and served in the Union Navy. He lived next door to Eric and Anna Martin, and she thought she knew someone in Norway that might be willing to marry a Swede. And so yeah, I know, mixed marriages can't cause it. At any rate, the lady that came over was Anna Paulina Olsen, came over with her daughter Marie. Supposedly she was a widow, but we haven't been able to track that. We suspect she was an unwed mother, and he overlooked that and brought her out. She died fairly shortly after she came out, about 6 years afterwards. So that gives you, I think, something of an idea of what life was like on the Columbia River with the various people coming in. There are many, many other stories that I've been gradually uncovering about people who arrived in the most unusual ways. life was very fluid here. People looked out for each other. If someone jumped ship, generally speaking, they could usually find somewhere to hide them. One of the most moving stories that I remember from an old friend of our family was, he was a black man named Paul Starkey, and his father, Richard Starkey, was born 3 years after the Civil War, and as an adolescent, he was with a minstrel show on the Columbia River on one of the stern wheelers, which stopped at Skamaka, and he jumped ship and found a family that hid him until the boat left, and ended up working in a logging camp for the Fiesel logging camp in Skamaka. So you have this kind of very fluid type of dynamic going on with the population here, how it grew and how people came together. And it's not at all like we like to think of tidy immigration with everyone with their documents and papers, and we all arrive at Ellis Island and see the Statue of Liberty. And in fact, on the West Coast, certainly on the Columbia River, there were a lot of other stories about immigration. It's hard to find them. They're shrouded in secrecy in many cases. People didn't want people to know. Certainly didn't want officials to know how they had arrived here. They changed their names, as I say. They had no papers. They obliterated all remembrances of who they might have been in that other place and how they got here. They didn't talk about the vessel they came on. They didn't mention any of that sort of thing because secrecy was the big deal for them in order to come here and make good. So I'm going to stop there because I've done proper load on you all tonight and see if there are any comments or questions. Yeah.
I have one question, just what you were just talking about. You were saying that they wanted to keep it secret, but once the ship left and they were working, why did it have to be a secret? Could they be prosecuted or whatever that term would be?
They also might have been in danger of being shanghaied by the crimps that were there. If someone knew that there was an able seaman, a well-trained seaman around, they could easily have been kidnapped and slapped on the next ship that went. One of the big deals was staying away from the bars and taverns because you were easy fodder. Astoria and Portland in particular were notorious for people being given knockout drops or a fair amount of alcohol in one of the bars with a newfound friend, and the next day they were crossing the bar out of the Columbia River, having been basically kidnapped and put on board a vessel. If you were a person who actually was a skilled seaman, you were really in danger. And that's one of the reasons they hid out these little communities and changed everything. Other comments or questions? Yeah.
Your background, Irene.
What about my background? Well, I'm an immigrant. I'll tell you the story of how my mother got to Canada. She was a war bride. My father went back on a troop ship to Canada. He was raised in Canada. And my mother was going to come out on a troop ship. And she was in Liverpool. The standard jumping off spot, it hasn't changed at all. She had me, I was 6 months old. And so she was put on this ship. And it collided with a cattle scow going out of Liverpool Harbor. So they put back into Liverpool, and we're told it was going to be weeks. So she telephoned, a very daring thing to do in those days, to her sister in London and said, I guess I'm staying longer. So they finally got her on another troop ship, and a number of the women that had planned on going to Canada after the big accident decided not to, and never did go back to see their husbands. But my mother was rather adventurous, so off she went, and it was a horrible crossing on the Atlantic. And they finally got to Halifax. She was very ill, seasick, and after they went through all the stuff at Halifax, they were put on a train to go to Rimouski, or to Montreal, actually. But she got appendicitis on the train, and there was a blizzard. And so this train had to stop because there was so much snow on the tracks, so they sent an ambulance to try and get her to a hospital in Rimouski, but finally the train started again and managed to get her to Montreal. And so it's Christmas Eve and she's in the hospital just having had her appendix out. No one speaks English, it's all French speaking. It was a French Catholic hospital, and she's got a baby. And my father's in Toronto. It was, my father kept getting, he told me later, he said, I get these telegrams, I'm arriving such and such a date. And he said, the day later I get a telegram, I'm not arriving. You know, and it went for months. It took her months to get here. And that was in 1947. And so it gives you an idea. And so I lived in Toronto a good part of my life, and I met and married my husband when we were in Newfoundland, and immigrated to the U.S. So I've immigrated to 2 countries now, which I think is why I have a certain amount of sympathy. It was so much easier for me. You know, I can't imagine what these women did under these circumstances. You know, if you're headed, you know, from, Liverpool or something to around Cape Horn, you've got 18,000 miles. And, you know, if you're seasick, good luck with that. You're going to be miserable for a long, long time on that sailing vessel. So I think, you know, it was enormously courageous for people to do the kinds of things they did to get here. And it wasn't a picnic. Nellie Megler, married to Joseph Megler, was really rather a grand dame of Brookfield. But Brookfield, face it, was a tiny little burg in the middle of nowhere. And she talks in she wrote this wonderful article on fish cannery and what that was like living, and you know, it's a pretty sight looking at all the ships or boats at sunset on the river. And then she said, but when it rains, as it can only rain in Oregon, the romance vanishes. And you know, you sort of see the wheels turning there. Have I made a mistake in this one? And also, it gives you, I think, more of an idea of just how tough life was when people got here. But it was better than what they had had. And that, I think, was the key thing about it. It was better than what they had had. And they had an opportunity to make something out of themselves. Yeah. Other comments or questions? Yeah?
My grandfather came from Denmark in the early 1900s, and my grandmother came a couple years later, and she was coming to see him, and they got married after she got it. Maybe she was the male of the bride.
Start looking.
They were not from the same town.
Yeah. Yeah, it could well be. I mean, Joseph Megler put an ad in the paper for... Yeah. Well, Joseph Megler put an ad in the paper after the Civil War. He fought in the Civil War. He was in the Navy. Hadn't had a chance to meet any women, so he put an ad in the paper. Nellie Megler was from North Brookfield, Massachusetts. I looked up the census for that, and virtually every marriageable aged man died in the Civil War. There was no one there. And so if you wanted to get married, you were going to have to sort of do the obvious and answer an ad or try and go to a place where there might actually be some men. And that was really the circumstance for a lot of women in those days, was that there weren't many men left for them to marry in a lot of those towns. I thought I saw another hand, didn't I? I did.
I'm thinking about the concept of marriage. I imagine they lasted longer. And not like today where, you know, you just get tired and walk off.
Well, they may have gotten tired, but they didn't walk off. For one thing, there were no roads. There was nowhere to go. Basically, they were really isolated. And also, you know, I started looking at the period of time that those marriages lasted, and both my husband's great-grandfathers were having a child about every 2 years. I forgot to mention this object. Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound. There were a baby in every bottle. I'm sure those women regretted that. Anyhow, but there were no doctors. You were basically stuck with elixirs like these, hopefully a neighbor that knew something about childbirth and could help you, and hopefully your husband was home to go and get that neighbor when you suddenly went into labor and everything. But there were all these patent nostrums like these, because there were no doctors. They were enormously popular among, this was for everything from fertility to menstrual cramps and all the rest of it. It didn't hurt that it was over 20% alcohol. And they still make it, by the way. You can still buy this stuff on the internet. I looked it up today to make sure that they're still selling it, and it showed up on the Walmart website. Just a new wrinkle for an old-time elixir. For you gentlemen, it was Dr. Kilmer's swamp root oil for bladder and kidney function. Just letting you know that one. But anyhow, Lydia Pinkham was what they relied on. My husband's great-grandparents swore by this stuff. Grandmothers swore by this stuff. But they had no doctor there. and they lost children, and ultimately Anna Martin died 2 days after the birth of her final child. But basically from what they called childbed fever in those days. And there was no help for it. There's nothing they could do. So, the child was orphaned in 2 days. And so her other daughter came home from Astoria and looked after the child. But it was a very tough life. There was, as I say, no medical help whatsoever. If you were lucky enough and had friends that would ward you, towards the end of your pregnancy, if you were able to get to Astoria and stay there, there would be a doctor in a place like Astoria or Portland, but nothing between. Absolutely nothing between. And some of those little places were out in the middle of nowhere, and it was hard to get around. Other questions, comments? Thank you very much, then.
Irene's got some great books up here, so come take a
I'll
look
be
at
around.
them.
If you want to take a look at a couple of the other things I brought too, you're welcome to come on up.
Chinese cannery work.
Yeah.
Irene, what's the significance of the spoon?
That was a homemade one, made, we think, by one of Kent's grandfathers or great-grandfathers, and everything because they couldn't afford to buy utensils or anything. They made it. Like he made one of his great-grandfather, Eric Martin, made this mesh board for mending a gill net with.
Now what does that one
It's
do?
called a mesh board. You measure the meshes on the net so you can keep the same meshes size
for
on a
nets.
fish net for mending it.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's real easy for us to.
Very good presentation. Thank
Thank you so much. I hope I didn't wander too far from the mic or anything.
No, that's okay.